The keycard slid through the reader with a soft beep, and I pushed open the employee entrance to Cascade Plaza for what felt like the 100th time this week. Except tonight was different. Tonight, I'd be alone. My footsteps bounced off the polished floors as I made my way through the service corridor toward the security office. 3 weeks of training shifts with Gary, learning the camera rotations and alarm protocols, and now he was finally cutting me loose. I should have felt ready. The knot in my stomach suggested otherwise. The security office door stood half open, spilling fluorescent light into the dim hallway. I could hear Gary moving around inside, the familiar sounds of him organizing paperwork and checking equipment. When I stepped through the doorway, he glanced up from the desk with that same expression he'd worn all week, like someone perpetually waiting for bad news. "Right on time." Gary's voice carried its usual gravelly tone, but something underneath felt strained. "Good. Pearl wants to see the handover go smooth." I dropped my jacket on the back of the spare chair and took in the office one more time. 2 rows of monitors lined the wall, cycling through camera feeds from every corner of the mall. The radio sat silent on the desk next to a clipboard thick with incident reports. Everything looked exactly as it had during training, but Gary's energy felt different, more wound up than usual. "She's been asking about you," he continued, pulling the night shift logs from a filing cabinet, checking how you're doing with the procedures. "That's good, right?" I settled into the chair I'd been using all week, running my hands through my hair. Means she cares about the training quality. Gary made a non-committal sound and continued shuffling papers. The silence stretched long enough to become uncomfortable, broken only by the soft hum of the air conditioning and the distant echo of the last few shoppers making their way toward the exits. I was about to ask about the evening's specific protocols when Pearl's voice carried down the hallway, growing closer. Gary's shoulders went rigid. "And make sure the loading dock gets locked down properly. Neil said he found it propped open again yesterday." Pearl stepped into the office, her professional smile sliding into place as she took in the scene. "How are we doing, gentlemen?" "Just going over the basics," Gary replied, not quite meeting her eyes. "Making sure Mateo knows the routine." Pearl moved around the desk to check the monitors, her presence filling the small space. She wore the same business casual outfit I'd seen her in during the day shift, but something about her seemed more alert now, more focused, like she was cataloging every detail. "Any questions about the camera rotations?" she asked, addressing me directly. "The timing is important. Every 15 minutes. Regular as clockwork." "Gary covered that pretty thoroughly," I said. "Check each feed, note any anomalies, document everything." "Good." Pearl's smile widened slightly. "Documentation is crucial. We need to know exactly what happens during the overnight hours." The way she emphasized exactly made my skin crawl, though I couldn't pinpoint why. Gary had mentioned that Pearl took security seriously, but her focus on the specifics felt more intense than necessary for a mostly empty mall. Gary cleared his throat and reached into his jacket pocket. "Actually, there are a few additional protocols I need to go over. Mall-specific stuff that isn't in the standard handbook." He pulled out a folded piece of paper, the edges worn like he'd been carrying it around for a while. Pearl's expression shifted almost imperceptibly, her pleasant mask developing a harder edge. "Gary, I don't think—" "Just some common sense guidelines," he interrupted, unfolding the paper carefully. "Things I've learned from experience." I caught Pearl's reflection in one of the monitor screens as Gary handed me the paper. She was watching him with the kind of focused attention you'd give a potentially dangerous animal. The professional friendliness had vanished completely. The paper felt heavier than it should have as I unfolded it. Gary's handwriting filled the page in careful block letters, each line numbered and underlined. I read the first rule and felt my eyebrows climb toward my hairline. Check all camera feeds every 15 minutes, no exceptions. If the food court camera starts flickering, reset the system immediately, and do not attempt repairs. I looked up at Gary, waiting for the punchline. He stared back with complete seriousness, his hands clasped tight enough that his knuckles had gone white. This is... I glanced down at the second rule. Don't look directly at the mannequin if it moves from the department store window display. Track its location using peripheral vision only. Keep reading, Gary said quietly. If the overhead lights start flickering in sequence, turn off all office lights immediately and lock the door. Remain in darkness until the activity stops. The words felt surreal coming out of my mouth. I could hear Pearl shifting her weight behind me, but I didn't turn around. Gary's expression told me he was deadly serious about whatever this was. Ignore Neil Moore, the night janitor, regardless of how many times you see him on camera. Do not attempt to contact or locate him. Gary, Pearl's voice carried a warning tone. I think you might be overwhelming. Number 5, Gary cut her off, his eyes never leaving mine. If a child appears on any camera feed, immediately grab your keys and radio and evacuate through the nearest employee exit. Do not investigate. Do not hesitate. I stared at the paper, reading the rules again to make sure I hadn't misunderstood something. They read like instructions for surviving a horror movie, not managing security for a suburban shopping center. Is this some kind of initiation thing? I finally asked. Like hazing for new guards? Gary's jaw worked silently for a moment, and I caught the slight tremor in his hands as he reached for the paper. Some things can't be explained properly, only survived. Gary? Pearl stepped closer, her voice taking on a professional authority that made both of us look at her. I think there's been a misunderstanding about our training protocols. No misunderstanding. Gary folded the paper back up and pressed it into my palm, closing my fingers around it. Keep this with you. Follow every rule exactly. Don't try to be clever or figure out why they exist. The urgency in his voice sent a chill down my spine. This wasn't the same man who'd spent 3 weeks patiently explaining camera angles and incident report procedures. This was someone genuinely afraid. Those rules aren't part of any official protocol, Pearl said, her tone carefully measured. And they might give you the wrong impression about working here. Gary turned to face her fully, and I saw something pass between them that I couldn't interpret. Not quite a challenge, but definitely not submission either. My family emergency, he said, the words coming out deliberately. I need to leave early tonight. Of course. Pearl's professional smile returned, but it didn't reach her eyes. I hope everything works out. It better. Gary grabbed his jacket from the back of his chair, moving with sudden purpose. As he passed me, he leaned down and spoke quietly enough that Pearl couldn't hear clearly. Don't trust anyone who tells you those rules aren't real. Some employees don't make it through their first week. The words hit me like cold water. Gary straightened up and headed for the door, pausing only to grab his radio from the charging station. Take care of yourself, Mateo, he said, loud enough for Pearl to hear. And remember what I told you. The office felt different after he left, smaller somehow. Pearl moved to the chair Gary had vacated, settling into it like she belonged there. He's been under a lot of stress lately, she said, her voice carefully neutral. Family situations can really affect people's judgment. I looked down at the paper in my hand, Gary's words still echoing in my head. The rational part of my brain agreed with Pearl. The rules were obviously nonsense, the product of too much isolation and too many late-night shifts. But Gary's fear had felt absolutely real. Has he always been... I searched for the right word. Paranoid? It develops over time, Pearl said, settling back in the chair. Working alone in empty buildings, letting your imagination run wild. It's more common than you'd think. She gestured toward the monitors, where camera feeds cycled through empty corridors and darkened storefronts. The mind starts creating patterns that aren't there, seeing threats where none exist. I nodded, though something about her explanation felt rehearsed, like she'd given this speech before. The important thing, Pearl continued, is to stick to actual procedures, real protocols, not superstitions or personal fears. Right. I folded the paper and slipped it into my pocket. Standard security practices. Exactly. Pearl stood up, smoothing down her skirt. I'll let you get settled in. If you need anything, you have my number. She paused at the door, turning back with what looked like an afterthought. And Mateo, if anything unusual happens tonight, anything at all, I want you to call me immediately. Not Gary, me. The emphasis on me felt loaded with meaning I couldn't decipher. I nodded anyway, and Pearl disappeared into the hallway, her footsteps fading toward the main entrance. Alone in the security office, I pulled Gary's paperback out and read through the rules one more time. They still sounded like complete insanity. Wandering mannequins and mysterious children, flickering lights and multiple janitors. The kind of urban legends that night shift workers probably invented to break up the monotony. But Gary's hands had been shaking when he wrote them. I looked up at the monitors, watching empty corridors stretch away into darkness beyond the camera range. The mall felt different at night, larger somehow, full of spaces that the security cameras couldn't quite cover. During training, Gary had walked me through every inch of the building, pointing out blind spots and explaining sight lines. Now those same blind spots felt ominous, like they were hiding something I wasn't supposed to see. The rational explanation was simple. Gary had been working nights too long and had started letting his imagination get the better of him. Pearl's reaction made sense. She was trying to prevent his paranoia from infecting the new guy. Standard management practice. But if that was true, why had Pearl watched Gary so carefully when he handed me the rules? And why had her pleasant demeanor vanished the moment he started talking about protocols she claimed didn't exist? I settled back in my chair and checked the time. 10:47 p.m. The mall had been closed for nearly an hour, and the building felt empty except for the occasional creak of settling metal and concrete. According to Gary's first rule, I should check all the camera feeds every 15 minutes. According to Pearl, I should ignore Gary's rules completely. I stared at the monitors, watching the food court camera cycle through its preset positions. Everything looked normal. Clean tables, empty chairs, the usual after-hours stillness of a space waiting for morning to bring it back to life. The camera feed flickered once, just for a second, then returned to normal. I blinked and leaned forward, waiting to see if it would happen again. The image remained steady, showing the same empty food court it had been displaying all evening. Probably just a glitch in the system. The kind of minor technical problem that happened in any building with this much electronic equipment. The feed flickered again, longer this time, the image dissolving into static before snapping back into focus. My hand moved toward the reset button before I consciously decided to follow Gary's first rule. The system reset with a soft chime, all the monitors going dark for a moment before cycling back through their startup sequence. When the food court camera came back online, the image was crystal clear and completely stable. I sat back in my chair, staring at the monitors and wondering what the hell I'd gotten myself into. 3 weeks ago, I'd been looking for the most boring, uneventful job I could find. Night security at a suburban mall had seemed perfect, quiet, routine. The kind of work where the biggest crisis would be a false alarm or a broken lock. Now I was sitting alone in an empty building, following rules written by a man who'd seemed genuinely terrified while trying to decide whether my boss was being helpful or manipulative. The Seattle situation had started with similar feelings. The sense that something wasn't quite right, that people were acting in ways that didn't match their stated motivations. I'd ignored those instincts then, convinced myself I was being paranoid, right up until everything fell apart and innocent people got hurt. I pulled Gary's rules out of my pocket and read them one more time. They still sounded insane. But Gary's fear had been real, and Pearl's reaction suggested she knew more about those rules than she was letting on. The smart thing would be to follow Pearl's advice. stick to standard procedures, ignore Gary's paranoid fantasies, and focus on doing the job I was hired to do. Keep my head down, avoid complications, and try not to repeat the mistakes that had forced me to leave Seattle in the first place. But as I looked at the camera feeds showing empty corridors stretching away into darkness, I couldn't shake the feeling that Gary's rules might be the only thing standing between me and something I really didn't want to encounter. I folded the paper carefully and put it back in my pocket, then checked the time again. 10:52 p.m., 3 minutes until my first official camera check. Whatever was going on in this mall, I had the feeling I was about to find out whether Gary's fears were justified, or if I was just letting his paranoia infect my better judgment. Either way, the next few hours were going to be very interesting. The red numbers on the desk clock read 11:17 p.m. when I reached for the camera control panel. 30 minutes into my first solo shift, and the weight of Gary's folded rules in my pocket felt heavier than it should have. I'd been putting off the camera check, telling myself I was just getting organized, but really I was avoiding the decision of whether to follow Gary's paranoid instructions or Pearl's rational advice. The first 12 feeds cycled through normally. Empty corridors, darkened storefronts, the loading dock with its neat stack of tomorrow's delivery pallets. Everything looked exactly as it should in a closed mall. When the food court camera came up in the rotation, I caught myself holding my breath. The image flickered twice, just like before, then stabilized into a clear view of empty tables and chairs. I watched for another 30 seconds, waiting. The feed stayed steady. Maybe the reset had actually fixed whatever was causing the problem. Technical glitches happened in buildings this size, especially with older camera systems that had been upgraded piecemeal over the years. Gary's first rule about immediately resetting flickering cameras could just be practical maintenance advice dressed up in supernatural language. I completed the rest of the camera check without incident and noted the time in the logbook, 11:20 p.m., all feeds normal. The next check would be at 11:35. Standard 15-minute intervals, just like Pearl had emphasized. I spent the intervening time reviewing the incident report procedures and familiarizing myself with the radio codes. Gary had covered most of this during training, but having it all spread out on the desk made the job feel more manageable, less mysterious. This was just security work, the kind of routine monitoring that thousands of people did every night across the country. At 11:33, I started the second camera check early, partly out of diligence and partly because the silence was getting to me. The building seemed to amplify every small sound. The hum of fluorescent lights, the distant rumble of the heating system, the occasional creak of metal expanding and contracting. During training, Gary's constant chatter had masked how quiet the place really was. The food court camera flickered on the third monitor in the sequence. This time I caught it immediately, watching the image dissolve into static for almost 3 full seconds before snapping back to clarity. According to Gary's rule, I should reset the system again. According to common sense, I should probably call building maintenance in the morning and report a recurring technical problem. I reached for the reset button and hesitated. Pearl's warning about Gary's paranoia echoed in my head, mixing with the memory of Gary's shaking hands and genuine fear. The smart thing would be to document the problem and handle it through proper channels. But Gary had seemed so convinced that following his rules was a matter of survival. I hit the reset button. All the monitors went dark for a moment, then cycled back through their startup sequence. When the food court camera came back online, the image was rock steady. I made a note in the log, 11:35 p.m. reset camera system due to food court feed malfunction. That seemed like a reasonable compromise between Gary's rules and proper documentation. The next 10 minutes passed without incident. I tried to focus on the paperwork Gary had left, but my attention kept drifting to the monitors, specifically to the food court feed, which continued functioning perfectly after the reset. Maybe Gary's rule was just practical troubleshooting advice after all. At 11:47, movement on the West Wing camera made me look up from the incident reports. A figure stood motionless in the corridor near the fountain, just at the edge of the camera's range. The image wasn't quite clear enough to make out details, but something about the posture seemed wrong. Too still, too rigid. I leaned forward and switched the West Wing camera to manual control, zooming in slowly. The figure came into focus, and my stomach dropped. It was the mannequin from the department store window display, the one Gary's third rule specifically mentioned. I'd seen it dozens of times during training, positioned in the storefront window wearing this season's fashion. A generic female form in a tasteful business outfit, hands posed naturally at its sides. Except now it stood in the middle of the corridor, 30 feet from where it belonged, facing directly toward the security cameras. The rational explanations came flooding in. Someone from the day shift had moved it for cleaning or maintenance. The night janitor was rearranging the display. There were a dozen logical reasons why a mannequin might be temporarily relocated. But Gary's third rule was burned into my memory. Don't look directly at the mannequin if it moves from the department store window display. Track its location using peripheral vision only. I forced myself to look away from the West Wing monitor and focus on the adjacent camera feeds. The East Wing corridor showed empty retail spaces with their security gates pulled down. The main entrance displayed the usual after-hours view of darkened glass and the parking lot beyond. Using peripheral vision to track the mannequin felt ridiculous, like playing an elaborate game of supernatural hide-and-seek. But every time I tried to look directly at the West Wing monitor, Gary's voice echoed in my head with that urgent warning about following every rule exactly. The food court camera flickered again. This time I reset the system without hesitation, keeping my eyes on the other monitors while the West Wing feed went dark and came back online. When I checked peripherally, the mannequin was still there, still perfectly motionless, still facing the cameras with that blank artificial stare. A soft knock on the security office door made me jump hard enough to bump the desk. I spun around to see Lucy Brewer standing in the hallway, waving at me through the door's window. I recognized her from training week, one of the day shift employees who'd been friendly and helpful when Gary was showing me around the building. Seeing her here after hours should have been reassuring, a familiar face in an increasingly strange situation. Instead, her presence felt like another variable in an equation that was already too complicated. I opened the door, noting that she was dressed casually in jeans and a sweater, rather than her usual work clothes. "Hey, Mateo," she said with a smile that looked genuinely relieved. "Sorry to bother you. I know this is your first night solo." "No problem. What's going on?" "I forgot my purse in the break room when I left this afternoon. I know it's after hours, but Pearl said it would be okay if I came back to get it." Lucy glanced past me toward the monitors, and I caught the subtle way her eyes avoided the West Wing feed. "She mentioned you might need the company anyway." The comment about Pearl giving permission felt important, though I couldn't quite figure out why. During training, Gary had stressed that after-hours access was strictly controlled, with exceptions only for emergencies or special circumstances. "Did you call ahead?" I asked. "I don't think I got any notification about after-hours access." "Pearl handles that directly," Lucy said, still not quite meeting my eyes. "She said you'd probably appreciate having someone around who knows the night procedures." The phrase "night procedures" sent a small chill down my spine. During training, Gary had never mentioned anything about Lucy being familiar with overnight operations. She was day shift, part of the retail management team that left when the stores closed. "I can escort you to the break room," I said, grabbing my keys and radio. "Standard protocol for after-hours access." Of course, I wouldn't want to wander around alone. As we left the security office, I deliberately avoided looking toward the West Wing monitor. But in my peripheral vision, I could see the mannequin still standing in the corridor like a silent sentinel. Lucy walked beside me through the main corridor, her footsteps echoing softly off the polished floors. She seemed comfortable navigating the darkened mall, taking turns toward the employee break room without needing directions. That familiarity was another small detail that didn't quite fit with her day shift status. "How's your first night going?" she asked as we passed the fountain where the mannequin should have been visible if we'd looked toward the west wing. Quiet so far. A few technical glitches with the camera system, but nothing major. Lucy nodded like she'd expected that answer. The building has its quirks. You'll get used to them. The way she said quirks suggested she knew more about those technical problems than a typical day shift employee would. I wanted to ask her about it directly, but something held me back. Maybe it was Gary's warning about not trusting people who claimed his rules weren't real. Or maybe it was the careful way Lucy kept her conversation neutral and avoided looking toward areas where Gary's rules might apply. The break room felt different at night, larger somehow, without the usual crowd of employees eating lunch or taking coffee breaks. Lucy went straight to the small bank of lockers against the far wall, producing a key from her pocket and opening one that I hadn't noticed was locked. She pulled out a standard-sized purse, but then reached back into the locker and retrieved something else, a small leather journal with worn edges. She slipped the journal into her bag quickly, but not so quickly that I missed seeing it. "Everything okay?" I asked. "Just some personal notes," Lucy said, closing the locker and pocketing the key. "Work stuff I forgot to take home." The explanation felt rehearsed, like she'd been prepared for that question. But questioning her further would mean admitting I'd been watching her closely enough to notice the journal, which might create its own problems. As we walked back toward the main corridor, Lucy glanced at me sideways. "Gary seemed pretty intense during your training," she said. "Did he give you any specific advice about working nights?" The question felt loaded with meaning I couldn't decipher. Lucy's tone was carefully casual, but she was clearly fishing for information about whether Gary had shared his rules with me. "He covered the standard procedures pretty thoroughly," I said, matching her neutral tone. "Security protocols, emergency contacts, that sort of thing." "Right, standard procedures." Lucy paused at the intersection where we'd need to turn toward the security office. "Can I ask you something?" "Sure." "If Gary gave you any unofficial advice, anything that seemed weird or paranoid, you should probably follow it anyway." Lucy looked directly at me for the first time since arriving. Some rules exist for good reasons, even when those reasons don't make obvious sense. The statement hit me like a physical blow. Lucy wasn't just familiar with Gary's supernatural rules. She was actively endorsing them. But her phrasing suggested she couldn't or wouldn't explain why. "Gary genuinely cares about your safety," she continued. "He's not paranoid, he's experienced." "Experienced with what?" Lucy shook her head. "I can't get into details, but trust me when I say that some things about this place are better avoided than understood." We reached the security office, and Lucy stopped at the door rather than following me inside. Through the window, I could see the monitors cycling through their feeds, the West Wing camera showing an empty corridor near the fountain. The mannequin was gone. I tried to process that information without showing my reaction. Either someone had moved it back to the department store window, or it had moved on its own. Neither explanation felt particularly comforting. "Thanks for the escort," Lucy said. "And Mateo, whatever Gary told you about staying safe, take it seriously." She turned and walked back toward the employee exit, her footsteps echoing through the empty corridors. I watched until she disappeared around the corner, then entered the security office and immediately checked the West Wing monitor. The corridor was empty. The fountain area showed no sign that anything had ever stood there. But when I switched to the department store camera, the mannequin was back in its window display, posed exactly as it had been during training. I stared at the monitor, trying to convince myself that I'd imagined the whole thing. Mannequins didn't move on their own. People moved them for practical reasons: maintenance, cleaning, display changes. There was a logical explanation for everything I'd seen. But Lucy's warning kept echoing in my head. Some rules exist for good reasons, even when those reasons don't make obvious sense. I checked the time, 12:03 a.m. I'd been so focused on Lucy's visit that I'd missed my scheduled camera check. As I started cycling through the feeds to make up for lost time, I noticed that the food court camera was functioning perfectly. No flickering, no static, just a clear, steady image of empty tables and chairs. Maybe resetting the system really had fixed the problem. Or maybe whatever had been causing the malfunction had simply stopped happening. I completed the camera check and noted everything in the log. 12:05 a.m., all feeds normal, after-hours access granted to Lucy Brewer for personal item retrieval. I left out the part about the mannequin moving, partly because I wasn't sure what I'd actually seen, and partly because I had no idea how to document something like that in an official report. As I settled back into the desk chair, Gary's rules felt less like paranoid rambling and more like practical survival advice. Lucy's endorsement carried weight because she clearly knew more about the overnight operations than she was willing to admit, and the mannequin had definitely been in the wrong place, regardless of how it had gotten there or how it had returned to the window display. The next camera check was scheduled for 12:20 a.m., 15 more minutes to sit alone in the security office, watching monitors that showed an empty building where mannequins apparently wandered around after midnight and day shift employees retrieved mysterious journals from locked break room lockers. I pulled Gary's rules out of my pocket and read through them again, paying special attention to the ones I hadn't encountered yet. Rules about flickering lights and locking doors. Rules about avoiding the night janitor and evacuating if children appeared on camera feeds. 3 hours into my shift, 2 of Gary's 5 rules had already proven relevant. The food court camera had flickered repeatedly until I followed his reset protocol. The department store mannequin had moved from its display case, and I'd tracked it using peripheral vision exactly as he'd instructed. Lucy's warning about taking Gary's advice seriously was starting to feel less like friendly concern and more like insider knowledge. She knew things about this place that she couldn't or wouldn't explain, and she'd gone out of her way to validate Gary's rules without directly admitting what they were designed to protect against. I looked at the monitors showing empty corridors and darkened storefronts, then checked the main entrance camera feed. The parking lot was empty except for Lucy's car pulling out onto the street, its taillights disappearing into the night. Whatever was happening in this mall after hours, I was pretty sure I was only seeing the tip of the iceberg. Gary's rules were designed to help security guards survive something, and Lucy's cryptic warnings suggested that survival might depend on following those rules exactly, even when they seemed to make no sense. I folded the paper carefully and put it back in my pocket, then checked the time again. 12:07 a.m. Still more than 6 hours left in my shift, and I had the distinct feeling that the mannequin incident was just the beginning. The smart thing would be to call Pearl and report what had happened. Tell her about the mannequin moving and Lucy's after-hours visit and the ongoing camera problems. Get her perspective on whether Gary's rules were really necessary or just elaborate paranoia. But something about the way Pearl had reacted to Gary's rules in the first place made me hesitate. She'd been too quick to dismiss them, too eager to discredit Gary's experience. And Lucy's comment about Pearl handling after-hours access directly suggested a level of involvement in overnight operations that Pearl had never mentioned during my training. I decided to wait and see what the rest of the night brought. If more of Gary's rules proved relevant, I'd follow them and document everything carefully. If nothing else happened, I could chalk up the mannequin incident to an overactive imagination and focus on doing the job I'd been hired to do. Either way, I had the feeling that by morning, I'd know a lot more about what really went on at Cascade Plaza after the stores closed and the lights went down. The next hour passed slowly, each camera check revealing nothing more unusual than empty corridors and darkened storefronts. I'd started to wonder if the mannequin incident was just an isolated incident, maybe a delayed reaction to the afternoon's display changes finally settling into place. Gary's rules still felt important, but the mall had returned to its normal overnight quiet. At 1:12 a.m., I was halfway through updating the incident log when the East Wing lights began to flicker. Not the quick, random flicker of a failing bulb, but a deliberate sequence starting from the far end of the corridor and moving steadily toward the main area. Each section of overhead lighting pulsed once, went dark for exactly 3 seconds, then came back on as the next section began its cycle. The pattern was moving directly toward the security office. Gary's second rule crashed through my head with perfect clarity. If the overhead lights start flickering in sequence, turn off all office lights immediately and lock the door. Remain in darkness until the activity stops. I didn't hesitate this time. My hand hit the light switch and plunged the office into complete darkness just as the corridor lights outside began their rhythmic pulse. The lock on the door clicked into place with a sound that seemed impossibly loud in the sudden silence. Through the door's small window, I could see the hallway lighting cycling through its strange sequence, each section going dark for those precise 3-second intervals before returning to normal brightness. But now, in the brief moments of darkness between cycles, I caught glimpses of movement in the corridors. Someone was walking through the mall with purpose, timing their movement to match the lighting pattern, moving from shadow to shadow, using the darkness to mask their progress through the building. I pressed myself against the wall next to the window, watching through the glass as the figure approached. The darkness made identification impossible, but their movement suggested familiarity with the building's layout. They knew exactly where they were going and how to use the flickering lights to remain hidden from the security cameras. The sequence reached the area directly outside the office, and for 3 seconds the hallway went completely dark. In that brief window, I heard footsteps pass directly by the door, so close I could have reached out and touched whoever was walking past. Then the lights came back on and the corridor was empty. The flickering pattern continued past the security office toward the west wing, following the same deliberate rhythm. I checked my watch in the darkness. 1:17 a.m. Gary's rule said to remain in darkness until the activity stopped, but he hadn't specified how long that might take. I waited, counting the seconds and listening for any sound that might indicate where the figure had gone. The building's normal settling noises seemed amplified in the darkness, every creak and distant hum taking on ominous significance. At 1:25 a.m., the lights stabilized. The sequence stopped as abruptly as it had begun, leaving the corridors in their normal overnight illumination. I waited another full minute before cautiously turning the office lights back on and unlocking the door. The hallway outside looked exactly as it had an hour earlier, showing no sign that anyone had passed through. But when I checked the camera feeds, my stomach dropped. The mannequin was gone. Not just moved from the corridor back to the department store window, but completely absent from every camera view. I cycled through all the feeds twice, checking every angle that might show the display areas. The window where it belonged stood empty, showing only the carefully arranged clothing and accessories that normally surrounded the figure. As I completed the third sweep of the camera system, movement on the maintenance corridor feed caught my attention. A man in a janitor's uniform was methodically mopping the floor near the loading dock, working with the steady efficiency of someone completely familiar with the building. Neil Moore. Gary's fourth rule specifically mentioned him. Ignore Neil Moore, the night janitor, regardless of how many times you see him on camera. Do not attempt to contact or locate him. I switched to the East Wing feed and found Neil there too, emptying trash bins with the same methodical precision. Same uniform, same build, same deliberate movements. The West Wing camera showed Neil organizing cleaning supplies in a storage closet. I stared at the monitors, cycling rapidly between the 3 feeds. Neil appeared on all of them simultaneously, performing different tasks in locations that were physically impossible to reach within the time frame I was observing. Each version moved independently, focused on their specific cleaning duties, apparently unaware of the other's existence. When I tried to focus on individual cameras, watching only one feed at a time, just one, Neil remained visible while the others seemed to fade from view entirely. But the moment I expanded my attention to multiple monitors, They all reappeared, working in their separate locations with that same steady efficiency. I forced myself to look away from the monitors and focus on Gary's rule. Ignore Neil Moore, regardless of how many times he appears. Don't attempt contact. The instructions seemed impossible to follow when Neil was apparently in 3 places at once, but Gary had been specific about not trying to understand the reasoning behind his rules. The office phone rang. The sound cut through the silence like a blade, making me jump hard enough to knock over my coffee mug. I stared at the phone for 3 rings before picking up the receiver. Security office. Mateo. Pearl's voice came through clearly, despite the late hour. I hope I didn't wake you. I'm fine. Everything okay? I'm monitoring the security system remotely, she said, her tone professional but with an undercurrent I couldn't identify. I noticed some unusual activity and wanted to check on you. The statement sent a chill down my spine. I hadn't realized that Pearl could access the camera feeds from outside the building, and the timing of her call felt too convenient to be coincidental. What kind of unusual activity? I asked, trying to keep my voice neutral. Power fluctuations in the lighting system, irregular camera cycling patterns. Pearl paused, and I could hear what sounded like keyboard clicks in the background. Have you encountered anything unexpected tonight? The question felt loaded with meaning. Pearl's tone suggested she knew exactly what I might have experienced, and she was testing to see how I'd respond. The cameras have been glitching periodically, I said carefully. Some flickering in the food court feed that required system resets. Anything else? I glanced at the monitors, where Neil continued his impossible maintenance routine across multiple locations. The rational part of my brain wanted to ask Pearl about the janitor situation, to get her perspective on what I was seeing. But Gary's warning about not trusting people who claimed his rules weren't real held me back. The mannequin from the department store display seems to have been moved, I said instead. Silence stretched across the phone line for so long that I wondered if the call had been disconnected. When Pearl finally spoke, her voice carried a different quality, more careful, more controlled. And the night janitor? Have you seen Neil Moore on the camera feeds? The specificity of the question confirmed my suspicion that Pearl knew more about these overnight incidents than she'd previously admitted. She wasn't asking about a routine maintenance issue. She was checking to see if I'd encountered the same impossible situation that Gary's rules were designed to address. He appears to be working in multiple areas, I said, deciding to be honest about what I'd observed. Another long pause. How many areas? 3, maybe 4 different locations simultaneously. I see. Pearl's tone had shifted again, becoming almost clinical. Mateo, I need you to listen to me very carefully. Follow Gary's rules exactly as he wrote them. Don't deviate. Don't try to investigate. Don't attempt to make contact with anything you see on the cameras. The urgency in her voice was unmistakable. This wasn't the same woman who dismissed Gary's rules as paranoid fantasy just a few hours earlier. This was someone who understood exactly what those rules were designed to protect against. What's going on, Pearl? What am I really dealing with here? I can't explain over the phone, she said quickly, but I need you to disconnect any remote monitoring systems that might be active. There's a red button under the main console. Do you see it? I looked beneath the desk and found a small red switch labeled Remote Access Override. I see it. Press it now. And Mateo, whatever you do tonight, don't call me again unless there's an immediate emergency. Someone might be listening to our communications. The line went dead before I could ask any follow-up questions. I stared at the phone receiver for a moment, then pressed the red button as Pearl had instructed. Several monitor screens flickered briefly, and a small indicator light on the control panel changed from green to red. The change was subtle, but the office felt different somehow. More isolated. Like I'd just cut the last connection between myself and whatever oversight Pearl had been providing from her remote location. I checked the camera feeds again. Neil had vanished from all of them, leaving the corridors empty except for the normal overnight stillness. The maintenance areas showed no sign that anyone had been working there. No evidence of the methodical cleaning I'd witnessed just minutes earlier. Pearl's warning about someone listening to communications echoed in my head as I tried to process what had just happened. She'd gone from dismissing Gary's rules to actively endorsing them, from claiming the overnight incidents were imaginary to monitoring them remotely in real time. Most unsettling of all, she'd seemed to know exactly what I'd encountered before I described it. The questions about the mannequin and Neil had been too specific, too targeted to be coincidental. Pearl wasn't just aware of the strange incidents, she was tracking them systematically. I pulled Gary's rules out of my pocket and read them again, but they offered no insight into Pearl's sudden reversal or her apparent knowledge of the supernatural events. If anything, they raised more questions about who really knew what was happening in this mall after hours, and why the truth seemed to be something that couldn't be discussed over monitored phone lines. The clock read 1:41 a.m., still more than 5 hours until my shift ended, and I had the distinct feeling that whatever I'd experienced so far was just the beginning. Pearl's warning about not calling her again suggested that the night's real challenges were still ahead, and that survival might depend on following Gary's rules even more carefully than I'd already been doing. I settled back into the desk chair and focused on the camera feeds, watching for any sign of movement in the empty corridors. The building felt different now, charged with a tension that hadn't been there earlier, like something had awakened when the lights began their sequence, and that something was still prowling through the darkened spaces beyond the camera's reach. Whatever was happening at Cascade Plaza, Pearl's involvement suggested it was far more complex than supernatural incidents or paranoid security guards. The truth was something that required remote monitoring, encrypted communications, and rules disguised as supernatural folklore. Nearly 2 hours had passed since Pearl's cryptic phone call, and the mall had settled into an almost oppressive quiet. I'd been cycling through the camera feeds every 15 minutes like clockwork, documenting each check in the logbook and trying to convince myself that the night's weirdness was behind me. The monitors showed empty corridors, darkened storefronts, and absolutely no sign of Neil Moore anywhere in the building. At 3:28 a.m., I started another routine check, working through the feeds with the kind of mechanical precision that comes from repetitive tasks. East Wing, West Wing, loading dock, employee areas. Everything normal. Everything as it should be in a closed shopping mall. Then I switched to the main corridor camera, and my blood turned to ice. A child stood at the far end of the hallway, small and perfectly still in the dim emergency lighting. A girl, maybe 8 or 9 years old, wearing what looked like an old-fashioned dress with puffy sleeves and a high collar. The kind of outfit you'd see in historical photographs or period movies, completely out of place in a modern shopping center. She began walking toward the security office with deliberate, measured steps. Gary's 5th rule exploded through my consciousness with the force of a gunshot. If a child appears on any camera feed, immediately grab your keys and radio and evacuate through the nearest employee exit. Do not investigate. Do not hesitate. I lunged for my keys and radio, knocking over the desk chair in my haste. The girl continued her steady approach down the corridor, her movements visible on multiple camera feeds as she passed through different camera zones. Not running, not skipping, just walking with an adult's purposefulness that seemed wrong on someone so young. The employee exit was 15 steps down the corridor from the security office. I'd memorized the route during training, practiced it in my head dozens of times. Get out, call for backup, let someone else handle whatever was happening inside. I reached the exit door and pushed the release bar. Nothing happened. I tried again, throwing my full weight against the door. The mechanism clicked like it was working, but the door itself wouldn't budge. Like something heavy was pressed against it from the outside, or like the lock had been reinforced beyond the normal safety release. The main employee entrance was across the building, past the fountain, and through areas where the girl would certainly see me. But Gary's rule had been specific about using the nearest exit, and this was supposed to be it. I ran to the loading dock, my footsteps echoing through the empty corridors in a way that made me cringe. The service door there had the same problem. The release mechanism worked, but the door stayed sealed. Emergency exits that wouldn't open in an emergency. The sound of children laughing drifted through the mall from somewhere I couldn't identify, sweet and musical and completely wrong for 3:30 in the morning. Multiple voices like a group of kids playing games during recess, their giggles echoing off the hard surfaces and mixing into something that raised every hair on my neck. I retreated toward the security office, but stopped when I saw the girl on the monitor. She'd reached the door and was standing directly outside, her face turned upward toward the camera with an expression I couldn't read on the grainy feed. The storage closet behind the office. Gary had shown it to me during training. A narrow space where they kept extra supplies and old equipment. Big enough for one person to hide in if necessary, though I'd never imagined needing to find out. I slipped inside and pulled the door closed just as I heard the first footstep in the hallway outside. The closet smelled like cleaning supplies and dust, cramped enough that I had to crouch between shelves of paper towels and backup radio batteries. Through the thin wall, I could hear the girl moving around the security office with the same deliberate pace she'd shown on camera. Her footsteps were too heavy for a child. Each step hit the floor with a weight that suggested someone much larger, like an adult trying to walk carefully in shoes that didn't quite fit. The children's laughter continued somewhere in the building, rising and falling in waves that seemed to move through different areas. Games of tag or hide and seek played out in the empty stores, voices calling to each other with the kind of carefree joy that belonged in playgrounds, not abandoned shopping centers after midnight. A door slammed somewhere in the distance, followed by running footsteps that weren't trying to be quiet anymore. Someone was moving through the mall quickly, abandoning stealth for speed. Keys jingled outside the storage closet, and I pressed myself deeper into the corner between the shelves. But instead of the closet door opening, I heard the familiar sound of the security office lock being turned from the outside. "Mateo?" Gary's voice, muffled but unmistakable. "Where are you? I saw your car in the parking lot." Relief flooded through me so completely that I nearly sobbed. Gary was back, which meant I wasn't alone with whatever was happening in the building. But his presence also raised immediate questions about why he'd returned after his family emergency and how he'd gotten inside when all the exits were locked. I opened the closet door cautiously and found Gary standing in the security office doorway, looking haggard and older than he had just a few hours earlier. His uniform was wrinkled like he'd slept in it, and his hands were shaking worse than I'd ever seen. "Thank God," I whispered, stepping out of the closet. "The exits are locked and there's something seriously wrong with this place." Gary looked at me with an expression I couldn't read, then glanced at the monitors showing empty corridors where the girl was no longer visible. "We need to talk," he said quietly, "and we need to do it fast." He moved to the door and turned the lock, then went to each window and checked that the blinds were completely closed. The careful way he moved suggested this wasn't the first time he'd needed to secure the office for a private conversation. "The family emergency?" I asked. "There was no family emergency," Gary said, settling into the desk chair like the weight of the world was pressing down on his shoulders. "I was told to leave early tonight, given a choice between walking out voluntarily or being carried out permanently." The children's laughter had stopped completely, leaving the mall in a silence that felt more ominous than the previous sounds. Like whatever had been playing games in the empty stores had finished their entertainment and moved on to more serious business. "Gary, I've been following your rules exactly, but nothing makes sense. The mannequin, the lights, Neil appearing in multiple places, and now a child who—" "The rules aren't about supernatural entities," Gary interrupted, his voice heavy with something between exhaustion and despair. "They never were." I stared at him, trying to process what he'd just said. "What do you mean?" "The mannequin isn't a mannequin. It's a person in disguise, monitoring how security guards react to unusual situations, testing whether they investigate or follow instructions to look away. Gary ran his hands through his hair, and I noticed they were trembling badly enough to make his wedding ring click against his skull. Neil doesn't work here. He's part of a crew that moves contraband through the building using the maintenance tunnels. The multiple sightings are different people wearing the same uniform. The revelation hit me like a physical blow. Everything I'd experienced tonight, every supernatural incident that had seemed to validate Gary's paranoid rules, had been carefully orchestrated human activity. The flickering lights are signals, Gary continued. They coordinate shipment arrivals and departures. When the sequence moves through the building, it's telling the crew where to position themselves and when to move product. And the child? I asked, though I was starting to suspect I knew the answer. Pearl's daughter. She brings her along during operations, lets her play in the empty stores while business gets handled. Gary's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. That little girl has seen things no kid should ever witness. Things that would get people like us killed if we accidentally saw them too. I sank into the second chair, my mind racing to reframe everything I'd experienced. The mannequin monitoring my reactions, Neil's crew moving illegal goods, Pearl coordinating from a remote location while her daughter played games in an abandoned mall. "How long have you known?" I asked. 3 months. I caught them during a particularly large shipment, saw enough to understand what was really happening. Gary looked up at the monitors, checking each feed methodically. I could have reported it, gone to the police, done the right thing. But Pearl made it clear that my family's safety depended on my cooperation. "So you created the supernatural rules?" I figured if I could keep security guards from witnessing the real activities, I could protect them without directly betraying Pearl's operation. Gary's laugh was bitter and short. Turns out I was just buying time for everyone involved. The implication of his words settled over me like a cold weight. Pearl hadn't just been testing my reactions to supernatural incidents. She'd been evaluating whether I could be trusted with criminal knowledge or whether I represented a liability that needed to be eliminated. "Tonight was my evaluation," I said. "Tonight was supposed to be your recruitment," Gary corrected. "Pearl wanted to see if you'd follow the rules without questioning them, prove you could take orders and keep secrets. But something went wrong with the timeline." As if summoned by our conversation, Pearl's voice echoed through the mall's PA system, crisp and professional despite the early hour. "Attention! The building is now under security lockdown. All exits are sealed, and no one will be leaving until certain operational issues are resolved permanently." Gary and I looked at each other across the desk, both understanding that whatever protection his supernatural rules had provided was officially over. Pearl was done with subtle testing and misdirection. The real confrontation was about to begin. "How bad is this going to get?" I asked. "Bad," Gary said, checking his watch. "But maybe not as bad as it could have been. There are things Pearl doesn't know, people she hasn't accounted for." The monitors showed movement in multiple corridors now, figures in dark clothing moving with purpose through areas that had been empty just minutes earlier. Pearl's crew, emerging from wherever they'd been hiding to begin what looked like a coordinated sweep of the building. "What do we do?" I asked. Gary stood up and moved to a panel I'd never noticed before, hidden behind a loose section of wall covering. Inside were emergency supplies, backup communication equipment, and what looked like detailed building schematics marked with routes that didn't appear on any official floor plan. "We survive," he said, pulling out a radio and checking its battery level. "And if we're very lucky, we help some other people survive too." I was reaching for the radio Gary had pulled from the hidden panel when the security office door burst open without warning. Pearl stepped inside first, followed by Neil and 2 men I didn't recognize, both wearing the same maintenance uniforms, but with faces that belonged in a completely different line of work. "Well, this is touching," Pearl said, her voice carrying none of the professional courtesy I'd heard during training. "Gary sharing old family stories?" Gary's hand froze on the emergency supplies. and I could see his shoulders tense like he was preparing for a fight he knew he couldn't win. The two strangers positioned themselves to block the doorway, while Neil moved to the monitors, systematically shutting down camera feeds with practiced efficiency. "Hello, Pearl," Gary said quietly, turning to face her with the kind of resigned calm that suggested he'd been expecting this confrontation for weeks. "You look tired, Gary. Family emergencies will do that to a person." Pearl's smile was sharp enough to draw blood, though I suppose calling it an emergency implies it's temporary. The implied threat hit Gary like a physical blow. His face went pale, and I watched him age 10 years in the space of a few seconds. Whatever leverage Pearl had over him went deeper than job security or criminal charges. "What do you want, Pearl?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady despite the fact that my heart was beating hard enough to make my chest ache. "Closure, Mateo, and clarity." She moved further into the office, forcing Gary and me to back against the equipment panels. "See, we've been running a very successful business here for almost 2 years. Money laundering through fake retail transactions, storing high-value merchandise in the abandoned spaces between active stores. Clean, efficient, profitable for everyone involved." Neil finished with the monitors and turned to face us, his expression utterly different from the harmless janitor persona I'd observed on camera. This was someone who'd been in situations like this before, someone comfortable with intimidation and violence. "The beauty of our system," Pearl continued, "is that it runs on ordinary night shift protocols. Security guards walking their routes, checking doors, logging normal activities while we handle our business in the spaces they're not supposed to monitor." "But then Lucy started paying attention," I said, remembering her suspicious knowledge of night procedures and the journal she'd retrieved from her locker. Pearl's expression darkened. "Lucy Brewer discovered our activities 3 months ago. Been gathering evidence ever since, documenting every transaction, photographing our inventory, recording license plates and delivery schedules." She gestured toward one of the men by the door. "She even managed to get photos of Marcus here unloading a particularly valuable shipment. Marcus didn't look like someone who appreciated being photographed without permission, the kind of man who solved problems by making them disappear permanently." "The journal," I said, connecting the pieces. "When she came back tonight, she wasn't just getting her purse. That leather journal contains 2 years of detailed records, financial transactions, participant identities, supplier connections, delivery schedules." Pearl's voice carried a mix of grudging respect and murderous intent. "Enough information to bring down our entire operation and everyone connected to it. She was planning to deliver it to federal authorities this morning." Gary found his voice again, though it came out strained and hollow. "You can't touch Lucy. She's not part of this." Gary. Pearl shook her head like she was disappointed in a particularly slow student. "Everyone's part of this now. Your supernatural rules were a nice try, keeping security guards away from our activities, but the system was failing. Too many questions. Too many people starting to notice patterns." The admission hit me like a punch to the stomach. Gary's paranoid-seeming rules had been real protection, just not from supernatural threats. He'd been trying to keep security guards alive by keeping them ignorant, creating a barrier between ordinary employees and deadly criminal activities. "Which brings us to your choice, Mateo," Pearl said, turning her full attention to me with the intensity of a predator evaluating prey. "You can join our operation permanently, share in some very substantial profits, help us maintain the security protocols that keep everyone safe and profitable. Or," I asked, though I suspected I already knew the answer, "or you face the same fate as the previous security guards who asked too many questions." Pearl's tone was conversational, like she was discussing weekend plans. "We've had 3 employees over the past year who couldn't adapt to our way of doing business. None of them work here anymore. None of them work anywhere anymore." The casual way she delivered the threat was somehow more terrifying than if she'd screamed it. This was someone who'd killed before and would kill again without losing a minute of sleep. My family. Gary said suddenly, his voice breaking. "Pearl, please. I've done everything you asked. I've kept quiet, followed orders, protected your operation. Just let them go." "Your family is insurance, Gary. Insurance that ensures continued cooperation." Pearl's voice softened with mock sympathy. "Your grandson walks to school every morning at 7:45. Same route, same timing. He's a good kid, very predictable, very vulnerable." Gary's hands clenched into fists, and for a moment I thought he might do something desperate. But the fight went out of him as quickly as it had appeared, replaced by the broken resignation of someone who'd already lost everything that mattered. "I've been trying to find a way to bring down your operation without getting them killed," Gary admitted, looking directly at me. "But every move I make puts them in more danger. Which is why you're going to help me clean up this mess," Pearl said, "starting with retrieving Lucy's evidence and dealing with our new friend here." I looked around the office, trying to spot anything I could use as a weapon or an escape route. The emergency supplies Gary had revealed might contain something useful, but they were on the other side of the room behind Pearl and her associates. Then I remembered the security system itself. The panels I'd been monitoring all night contained more than just camera controls. Emergency protocols, building systems, communication networks, including an automatic alert system that connected directly to local emergency services. "I need a minute to think about this," I said, moving toward the main console like I was considering Pearl's offer. "Take your time," Pearl said, though her tone suggested patience had limits. "But understand that once you know what you know, neutrality isn't an option. You're either with us or you're a liability that needs to be eliminated." I reached the control panel and began working through the settings as if checking camera feeds. But instead of cycling through monitors, I was accessing the emergency systems Gary had shown me during training. Fire alarm, security lockdown, emergency services notification. "You know what?" I said, turning back to Pearl with what I hoped looked like resigned acceptance. "I've been running from problems for too long. Maybe it's time to stop running and start making some real money." Pearl's smile was genuinely pleased, like she'd just completed a successful business negotiation. "I knew you were smart, Mateo. Gary, you see? This is how professional people handle changing circumstances." While she was talking, I pressed the emergency alert sequence hidden beneath the main panel. The system would automatically contact police and fire departments, unlock all exits, and activate emergency lighting throughout the building, but the notification would take several minutes to process, and the building's response would be even slower. "What's the first step?" I asked, buying time for the alert to register. "First, we retrieve Lucy's evidence. Then we discuss your new responsibilities and compensation package." Pearl moved toward the door, gesturing for Neil and the other men to follow. "Gary, you'll stay here and monitor communications. Make sure no one else gets any inconvenient ideas about calling for help." But as Pearl reached the doorway, emergency lights began flashing throughout the mall. The building's PA system crackled to life with an automated announcement. "Emergency services have been notified. All exits are now unlocked. Please proceed to the nearest exit in an orderly fashion." Pearl spun around to face me, her expression transforming from businesslike satisfaction to murderous rage in the space of a heartbeat. "What did you do?" "The right thing," I said, already moving toward the emergency supplies Gary had revealed. "Finally." Chaos erupted in the small office. Marcus lunged toward me while Neil scrambled to regain control of the security systems. But Gary was faster than either of them, tackling Neil and sending both men crashing into the monitor bank. "Loading dock!" Gary shouted over the noise of fighting and emergency alarms. "Back exit, past the maintenance area." I grabbed a heavy flashlight from the emergency supplies and swung it at Marcus as he tried to grab my arm. The impact sent him stumbling backward into Pearl, giving me just enough space to reach the doorway. Gary was behind me a second later, blood running from a cut on his forehead, but moving with desperate energy. Together, we ran through corridors that were now bathed in the red glow of emergency lighting. heading toward the loading dock where Gary's knowledge of the building layout gave us a crucial advantage. Behind us, I could hear Pearl screaming orders to her remaining associates, her voice echoing through the mall with the kind of fury that comes from watching a carefully constructed operation collapse in real time. The loading dock exit stood open, exactly as the emergency system had promised. But as we reached the doorway, Gary grabbed my arm and pointed toward the parking garage. "Look," he said. Lucy stepped out of the shadows between two parked cars, but she wasn't alone. 3 men in FBI windbreakers flanked her, with more agents emerging from concealed positions throughout the parking area. She was talking rapidly into a radio, coordinating what looked like a carefully planned operation. "She's been working with federal agents," I said, understanding flooding through me. "For weeks," Gary confirmed. She was waiting for something to force Pearl's hand, create enough chaos to move in safely. He looked back toward the mall where sirens were growing louder by the minute. "Turns out your emergency alert was exactly what she needed." Lucy spotted us and jogged over, her expression mixing relief with professional urgency. "Are you both okay? How many people are still inside?" "Pearl, Neil, and at least 2 others," I said. "They were trying to destroy evidence when we left." "Not anymore," Lucy said, gesturing toward the mall where FBI agents were already entering through multiple access points. "We've been tracking this operation for months, waiting for the right moment to move in without losing evidence or putting civilians at risk." Gary was staring at her with something between admiration and disbelief. "All this time, you were law enforcement?" "Federal task force investigating money laundering operations in retail locations across the Pacific Northwest," Lucy confirmed. "Pearl's group was just one piece of a much larger network." The irony wasn't lost on me as police cars and FBI vehicles filled the parking lot. Gary's supernatural rules, designed to hide criminal activity, had accidentally created the perfect conditions for exposing it. By keeping security guards away from Pearl's operation, he'd preserved evidence and prevented potential witnesses from being eliminated. "Your family," I said to Gary as paramedics approached to check his head wound. "Safe," Lucy said before he could answer. "We moved them to protective custody yesterday when we realized Pearl was planning to eliminate loose ends. Your grandson never knew anything was wrong." Gary's legs gave out, and he sat down hard on a concrete parking barrier. The relief was so overwhelming that he started crying, silent tears running down his face as the weight of months of terror finally lifted. Looking back at the mall where Pearl's criminal empire was being dismantled by federal agents, I realized that sometimes the right choice isn't about perfect safety or complete understanding. Sometimes it's about trusting your instincts, even when you can't see the whole picture. Gary's rules had been fake, but his protective instincts had been real. Pearl's supernatural stories had been lies, but her criminal operation had been devastatingly genuine. And my decision to trigger the emergency alert had been based on hope rather than certainty, but it had saved lives and exposed the truth. The night that had started with paranormal protocols had ended with very human justice. But as FBI agents led Pearl and her associates away in handcuffs, I couldn't help but think that Gary's approach, protecting people through misdirection rather than confrontation, had worked better than anyone could have planned. Sometimes the best way to fight monsters is to make them think you can't see them clearly, right up until you're ready to turn on all the lights.